Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are we getting on? So, we're taking a little look at the fact that Bethesda may be facing a class action lawsuit. Maybe. In this video today. And I'm covering this even though it's a bit of an old piece of news in some ways, but it's got some new developments recently, particularly in light of their acquisition by Microsoft. And it's also come back into the sort of news sphere again in the last few days. So I thought I'd cover this, talk about what's going on, and we'll have a little look at it, just to shed some light on what on earth this is that is entering into the news sphere once again as regards Bethesda and them as the creators of Fallout. Okay, so a couple of little orders of business before we jump in. I'm not going to go into all the details on this particular article. It's reasonably extensive and would be here all day if it did, so we'll keep it to a sensible length. If you do want to have a look at it, I will link it down in the description below. A couple of little caveats if you do. I would encourage you to read it. It's interesting, to say the least, particularly if you have interest in the legal side of stuff. But I would say, first and foremost, that it's worth being aware that there are issues on both sides here that are worth reading with a bit of a critical eye. There's definitely some holes in Bethesda's defense here. There are some fairly sizable holes in the Plaintiff's case as well, so critical eye recommended. It's also worth noting that there are a few occasions that I will probably point out that the article phrases certain things in a way that makes it sound like a statement of fact, even though it's not on any level whatsoever. It's somebody's opinion, which is a fairly common practice in these sorts of articles in general, but it's worth being aware of going into this, and just to let you know to read it with a critical eye. So would recommend taking a little look though. It's definitely an interesting read. So the other thing, of course, is I'm going to be doing some serious speculation here and offering a few opinions as well, just my thoughts and my initial responses to the information in this article. Obviously, not a lawyer, no expert on this. This is just my interpretation based on what I do know, so could well be wrong in some areas. I think I'm probably not, or I wouldn't say it, but, you know, it's... take it with a pinch of salt as well, so we'll see what happens in future, I guess, is what I'm saying there. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's actually have a look at this. Right now, this particular lawsuit is not a class action lawsuit. It looks like the plaintiffs are potentially considering turning it into one. This is something that has been hanging around for a while. This lawsuit was initially filed back in 2019 as a false advertising suit. And as you will see from the links down below the video and stuff, it is related to the DLC and the Season Pass and the Creation Club for Fallout 4, rather than 76, and the way that was marketed and the way it was handled by Bethesda and things like that. Personally, my takeaway from this is that it's not perhaps the best faith ever in terms of an argument here. It seems to me that there's a lot of unrealistic expectations which were, funnily enough, not met. Tends to be the way with unrealistic expectations. That's kind of the clue in the name, you know? So that seems to have led some people into being rather upset about their unrealistic expectations not being met, and the lawsuit then is them looking to go for a cash grab, in my opinion. I'll touch on this more in a bit, but in short, I think it's, in the case of any lawsuit like this, the plaintiff will have to prove that they have sustained damage. They have been harmed in some way by the action of the defendant. That's kind of the underlying principle of lawsuits like this, and to be honest, that's going to be a hard sell, I think, to prove that they actually have been harmed by the actions here, because I personally don't think they have at all, and as to whether or not a court would feel the same way, not a lawyer, not a judge. I'll have to wait and see, but I think personally that it's a stretch. So let's have a little look at this. So the ins and outs of it being that Bethesda and its parent firms, ZeniMax, are about to face some uncomfortable questions in a class action lawsuit. Maybe, maybe not, on the class action bit. Related to Fallout 4. They're implying that the recently deceased CEO, Robert Altman, was known for being litigious, although here we have a single example of ZeniMax filing a lawsuit against somebody. One example. That doesn't really make a man known for being litigious, in my opinion. It just means he filed a lawsuit at some point. This is blowing it up out of all proportion. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't further examples, there probably are, but yeah, one example does not make a large picture. So a bit of a questionable start there. But basically the case here is that surrounding the DLC for Fallout 4. So Fallout 4 came out in 2015, and during the course of 2016, I think for the most part, the 6 DLC came out, and the Creation Club was then released later on, I believe 2017, around about the time mods were coming into the game with official support. So later on, the big question of this is whether or not the Creation Club is DLC and should therefore be included in the Season Pass or not. Attorneys in the class action say that they are shocked at some of the legal mistakes that Bethesda has made in a case involving the downloadable content for Fallout 4. It isn't yet clear how much financial exposure the company has, with the attorneys suing say it's a loss of money. Of course they do, they're the suing attorneys. It's not unreasonable to think it could be in the $1 billion plus liability they claim. Maybe not. We'll be seeing that later on. So, Fallout 4, massive smash hit. 2 months before the game shipped, Bethesda announced that they were selling a Season Pass for $30 that entitled gamers to all the DLC for the game. Phrase used here is a lifetime of, but again, we'll see. Apparently Bethesda said at the time, "We've always done a lot of DLC for our games, we love making them, and you always ask us for more." Yeah, that's fair enough. To reward our most loyal fans, this time we will be offering a Season Pass that will get you all of the Fallout 4 DLC we ever do for $30. That doesn't quite... Yeah, it does sound like Bethesda phrasing, actually. Since we're still hard at work on the game, we don't know what the actual DLC will be yet, so this is before the game was even launched, but it will start coming early next year. Based on what we did for Oblivion, Fallout 3 and Skyrim, we know that it will be worth at least $40. The actual total is actually $60. And if we do more, you'll get it with the Season Pass, i.e. the difference between that $40 and the $60, I think that would include. So, the question here is whether or not the Creation Club that came along afterwards should be considered DLC and included in this all of the DLC claim, and therefore, should you get access to the Creation Club if you had the Season Pass? Obviously, the plaintiffs say yes, Bethesda say no. On June 11, 2017, Bethesda announced something called the Creation Club. The company characterized the Creation Club as a collection of all new content for both Fallout 4 and Skyrim. It features new items, abilities, gameplay created by Bethesda Game Studios and outside development partners, including the best community creators. I'm sure you remember the launch of the Creation Club. Creation Club content is fully curated and compatible with the main game and official add-ons. While it sounds like mod or community-created modifications for the game, it's really DLC, mostly created by Bethesda itself, said Filippo Marchino and Thomas Gray, the attorneys at the class action law firm, who are litigating this particular case. So basically, they're alleging that the Creation Club's content is the same as DLC, whereas Bethesda basically say it ain't. And there is a strong argument on both sides for this. So Bethesda kind of left themselves open, as we'll see in a second on this, but at the same time, what the point that the case is trying to litigate is what is DLC, what constitutes DLC, and without a hard and fast definition, which there isn't, because just about every games developer does DLC in a slightly different way. If you look at the way Bethesda do it, basically it's the large blocks of content like that were released for Fallout 4, so you've got Automatron, the 2 workshops, Vault-Tec and the contraptions, and then there's Nuka World and Far Harbor. That will be DLC. If you were to say on the part of CD Projekt Red, for example, the developers of the Witcher series and Cyberpunk 2077, they go with a different approach and say DLC is tiny bits of free add-ons, maybe little things like here's a new horse, here's some new cars, here's some new guns. Whereas they would say big story stuff, more like Far Harbor and Nuka World, for example, with Fallout 4, that would be an expansion. So the point I'm making is that depending on which company you're looking at, the definitions change a lot anyway, so they're trying to litigate based on a definition that doesn't exist, which is a problem for the plaintiffs. So that certainly opens up a question of just how far is this actually going to get. So chunk of opinion bit there, but basically the gist of it is somebody who bought the Season Pass felt that he should have got all of the Creation Club in it as well, and felt ripped off, disappointed that he didn't. My take on that, to be honest, would be that that would be the unrealistic expectation I met earlier. If you look at the 6 DLC for Fallout 4, you've got basically roughly $10 a pop if you buy them individually. If you get the Season Pass, that was initially at $30 and later put up to $50, I believe it was. So either way, below the price of the whole lot, it's still getting the whole lot for less than its ostensibly list price. So in that regard, whilst they suggested that it would all future DLC would be included, the fact that the Creation Club isn't is kind of stretching it a bit. I mean, expecting a company to stick to giving $60 worth of content away for $30 is one thing, but then adding, I believe it says somewhere in here, $280 worth of additional content on the top of it for free for everybody who bought this pass, which may be millions of people. Why would any business do that? That is insane. If you look at a situation with a single-player game, basically the income comes from the purchase price of the game and then any DLC. So reducing the price means a massive hit to the potential revenue the game can generate. There are no extra revenue streams for the game. 76 is a bit different. They're giving away all the DLC for the updates for that for free, but there's the Atomic Shop in there that is bringing in significant amounts of revenue on the side on top of the initial purchase price of the game, and you don't have that with a single-player game. Well-established point, obviously. And obviously that is what allows the game to continue running, especially in light of, cost of hiring servers from AWS and stuff like that, and developing new content. So expecting them to keep giving away freebies on a game with no additional revenue streams doesn't make any business sense. It's not something any business would do. It's not something that, to use a somewhat legal term, any reasonable person would expect of a business to just give you stuff for free with no end on it. So I don't. This is where I think it's the unrealistic expectation thing, like I say, and whether or not a reasonable person would expect it is a significant basis for this sort of argument in a legal case. So I think there's going to be an issue for the plaintiffs and their attorneys there to try and argue their way around, in that expecting a business to keep giving stuff away for free with no other form of income is a little unrealistic, to say the least. So what the plaintiff's lawyer is basically trying to say here is that Bethesda sold a season pass with the understanding that all future DLC would be available to holders of the season pass, and then they went back on that by not including the Creation Club in it. So ultimately the question is, did they do that, and is the Creation Club DLC? Bethesda obviously say no, the plaintiffs say yes. It's going to be an interesting one to see how that goes through a court system if it gets that far. Interestingly, this has got to the discovery phase, so it basically means the court has decided that there might be a case here, which is not good news for Bethesda, and as is mentioned later on, the likely outcome is probably going to be a settlement of some kind or other. That's kind of a no-brainer, though. If you said that about every single lawsuit ever, you'd be right more often than you're wrong. So that is what it is. It doesn't really mean much. So they released a limited amount of DLC, and then released a second wave of DLC, and decided to call it the Creation Club to artificially remove it from the definition of DLC. So alleges the plaintiff's lawyer. The problem here is that you can't artificially remove something from a definition that doesn't exist. Which obviously he's saying there's a definition for DLC that isn't. As we've just mentioned before, different companies have different definitions for DLC, for expansion, so on and so forth. Bethesda have their way of doing things, CDPR have theirs, other developers have theirs as well. To try and say that there's a hard and fast definition is absolute rubbish. If this ends up in a courtroom, there may well be a hard and fast definition of it in future in a legal sense, because until these things are actually litigated, they're not set in stone. So that may be an outcome of this, that there is actually a legal definition of what constitutes DLC and what doesn't. But for right now, I'm fairly confident that there is no hard and fast definition of it. So saying that they artificially removed it from something that is as vague as the term DLC is rather difficult. I mean, if you look at the words downloadable content on their own, what it literally means is content for a game that can be downloaded. It can mean literally anything. If you look at Skyrim's mods, for example, there are some absolutely massive expansion type mods on the Nexus for that game. Whole new areas, whole new quests. They're DLC-sized mods. And you download them for the game. Is that downloadable content? No, obviously not. But by the words downloadable content, yeah, kinda. So you see the argument I'm making there. In a legal sense, this is going to be a tough sell, I think, either way for the plaintiffs. Bethesda obviously could have handled this better and should have gone out and actually said, look, this is what it's going to include. They jumped the gun a bit by doing it before it was there. Not including the Creation Club is an iffy thing and should definitely have been handled better, but whether or not they actually did anything that was wrong or inappropriate, there's an element of unrealistic expectations, as I said there before, so I don't really think that it's quite what it's being made out to be by the plaintiffs here, to say the least. So, as a little aside, my guess for what actually happened inside Bethesda here will be that they announced the Season Pass prior to having the DLC set up, with the expectation of releasing DLC in the way they did for their previous games, i.e. just the 6 main DLC. And I suspect later on they came up with the idea of the Creation Club as an additional way of adding content to the game and obviously monetizing that and making the revenue back, the money back for actually creating it. And this came as a separate idea later on that then was put into action, and it has then been assumed that that is the same thing as the stuff that came before by parties outside of Bethesda, whereas Bethesda have themselves treated it as something different, separate ideas, separate entity essentially, that came along later than the DLC thing. So whether or not that's going to have any impact, if it's the case, it may not be, but if it is the case, whether or not it'll have any impact on the court case here that we're talking about, I don't know. It may well not do, but that would be my guess as to the way this actually went inside of Bethesda, as opposed to some kind of malicious behaviour. I think that's the more likely scenario. If the Creation Club is DLC, then arguably it should have been included, but if Bethesda are right in saying that by their definition of DLC that ain't it, then what they did was perfectly okay. There's also an element of just how far in advance did people know that did Bethesda know and did customers know that the Creation Club wasn't going to be included? Did they put this news out far enough in advance? I suspect they probably did, and say that this will be a paid-for thing. The idea of paid-for mods was something that had people up in uproar early on after the Creation Club was announced, so I don't think there's an argument to be made for them deceiving people over the fact that the Creation Club will be come with a cost. So again, I think there's some pretty shaky ground that the plaintiffs are standing on here. Okay, so as I'm scrolling down here, I'm just spotting another thing that I have that is an issue with both the way this article is put together and the way that the arguments perhaps being made by the plaintiffs here. It's more the inclusion of the plaintiff's materials here. So we've got a comment on how similar here the Creation Club content is to DLC content. So you've got another game's... I assume they're insinuating that's DLC. It's kind of hard to tell from this. It's very unclear. Don't know what the game is. Not sure what the hell's going on here. But there we go. Then we've got the Red Nuka-Cola Power Armor from Fallout 4, which they are basically saying was DLC. Each is an item that players will pay more to have more power in the game. Not actually accurate. And there is a Creation Club item, the Black X2 Fallout 4 Power Armor. Okay, so the big problem here is they're implying that this particular power armor is a DLC item. Yes, it is. It's available halfway through Nuka World if you can find it. It's one small thing in a much larger DLC packet. You can't buy this power armor on its own. That is not true of the Creation Club item, which is a standalone item, so it's quite fundamentally different. They're trying to pull something out and saying it's something you can buy as DLC that is the same as something else, when it just clearly isn't. So, that's a pretty shaky argument, or at least to me who knows what the DLC was. To somebody who didn't know, who may be looking at this as an outside point of view, that might fly with them, which is more than a little bit contemptible, to be honest, if that's what they're trying to do. But it's also kind of the nature of courtroom law. Bethesda would obviously make the same point I have just made. But to see that then included in the article is, this is the gaming arm of VentureBeat's larger journalistic enterprise, I suppose, for a better way of putting it. So these guys should know the difference, and they're including it as if it's a statement of fact, but it's kind of not. I mean, they would obviously argue the other way, and such is their right, but it's certainly leading people to assume something that is not actually, in my opinion, true. Okay, so I've talked quite a bit so far about what I think are some of the shortcomings on the plaintiff side, and I think they're pretty substantial, and they've got an uphill climb for a lot of these claims. But Bethesda have also dropped the ball in some significant ways as well. Obviously, they're arguing that the Creation Club is not DLC, and that it is different to DLC, which is why it's not included in the Season Pass. And there is, let's say, wiggle room on both sides. It's content that is downloaded. It was produced by Bethesda in the main, not all of it by any stretch of the imagination, but large chunks of it were, and then sold by them for a profit, much like DLC is usually. So there is definitely an argument that says because Bethesda developed so much of this stuff, it's DLC as opposed to some other form of content. So that is kind of a bit of a shaky ground for Bethesda. Obviously, there's some open questions as to whether or not they handled this very well, and they should have been more forthright in their marketing, and that is a key point of the case here. and it also does stand somewhat against them, as the marketing for the Season Pass basically did imply that all future DLC would be included in it. Then, of course, as I say, we run into that definition. There's also the slight issue that they didn't include an end-user license agreement that might have set out what is and is not included in certain things. The major reason for this, at least as far as this case goes, I suspect, is that at the time they put the Season Pass out there, they didn't have a solid basis for what was going to be in it, so they can't say this will be in it when they have no idea what this might be. But unfortunately, that does then leave them open to the situation. Beyond that, as I say, because they didn't specify what would be included in the Season Pass, and they didn't actually include a cut-off date either in terms of a cut-off date or in terms of a cut-off to what content was included, that does leave it very open-ended and leaves the expectation, a possibility that people could have assumed that anything in future that comes would also be included on that, which is the basis on which this particular case has been put forward. So definitely a cock-up on Bethesda's part there. Coming on here, there are a couple of other points that are listed in the article that do sit somewhat against Bethesda, in that when describing how the Creation Club was going to work and what kind of quality of content could be expected from it, they did say it was going to go through the full internal dev cycle. They said that it was going to be approved, curated and managed by Bethesda themselves. A significant part of it is produced by Bethesda. And you've even got some comments from Pete Hines describing it as being almost like mini DLCs, which do stick pretty much against the suggestion that it might not be included in the Season Pass and the assertion that it is not DLC. So that is a bit of an issue for Bethesda as well. I don't necessarily think it's entirely a problem. I think the description of it in terms of it being curated inside and going through an internal dev cycle is probably going to be more harmful to their case than Pete Hines' statement that it's like mini DLCs, because he used the words almost, and almost is not the same kind of definition of the word. And mini DLC is, mini is not the same. It's smaller. So it's sort of similar. It's projected in a way that people can understand and have something to compare it to without saying it's the same thing. So I don't think that's going to be a big issue. But the internal curation and stuff definitely does blow a hole in Bethesda's argument. So definitely a bit of a weakness on that front and potentially problematic for them. So the big question of how this is impacted by recent developments, particularly around Bethesda's acquisition, or ZeniMax rather's acquisition by Microsoft, is an interesting one. So a few years ago, there was an incident wherein ZeniMax acquired Human Head Studios, who were developing a number of games which arguably may or may not have run in competition to some of Bethesda's own games. And that was absorbed by ZeniMax and turned into Roundhouse Studios, which eventually ended up being closed down and incorporated into the larger company by ZeniMax. So there's an ongoing case with that, which has yet to go anywhere either, but it basically suggests that Bethesda allegedly deceived investors in Human Head Studios and moved the assets of Human Head Studios into other parts of Bethesda, and that meant that it deprived the investors of their potential return on the investment they had made. So they are basically suing Bethesda over that in a separate case. That's an ongoing thing. It's been going on for quite some time. So given the allegations in that other lawsuit, implying that Bethesda basically, ZeniMax, pulled all the resources out of Human Head and then left it with basically nothing, the plaintiffs, particularly the plaintiffs' lawyers in this particular case, regarding Fallout 4 are implying that they have concerns that the Microsoft deal might be part of a goal to make sure that Bethesda's assets are not available to any potential outcome of this case, i.e. making sure that they can't sue for damages in terms of money that Bethesda doesn't have because it's Microsoft's money. So basically the question here is whether or not a judge will rule to say that the deal with Microsoft has to be on hold until this is settled. So I really don't know what to say on whether or not that will actually be a thing. It might not. It seems like a stretch. From the look of things in this article, it seems to suggest that there isn't a great deal of solid evidence to suggest that Bethesda did what they were accused of in the case with Human Head Studios. Obviously, there's an allegation there, but it's not gone anywhere and it's been running for a while, so whether or not it'll actually come to anything is a different matter. But the other side, of course, is what impact might any settlement of this case have on Microsoft? In the grand scheme, not very much, whatever way it goes. But it is conceivable, I suppose, that they might not want this to happen after they acquire ZeniMax, as if this is wrapped up and finished before ZeniMax is acquired by Microsoft, any outgoings will appear, I would assume, on Bethesda's books, but not Microsoft's, whereas if it happens after that deal has gone through, then any outlay on Bethesda's part for a settlement or anything else may well appear on Microsoft's books themselves, which they may not want. Speculation there, but that seems like a possibility. There's a suggestion here that there's a rush to sell, and they're implying that I don't know if there's a typo here or not. They're talking about a letter Bethesda's lawyers sent back to them that is apparently dated 10th of July 2019, saying that there's no truth to, or no evidence at least, to the idea that Bethesda might be in talks to be sold, or ZeniMax. And there's a statement just after this in the article that based from the plaintiff's lawyer, which basically suggests it's odd that 2 months later the agreement's announced. Thing is, July 2019 to September 2020 ain't 2 months. It would be a year and 2 months, which is a whole lot of different time. If this is not a typo, then suggestions that it's 2 months when it's actually 14 are probably going to shoot the plaintiffs in the foot. On the other hand, if it is a typo and it is a 2 month difference, then yeah, that could work against Bethesda and potentially the sale to Microsoft as well, and potentially result in an injunction stopping the sale of ZeniMax going through until after this is settled. So there's a possible scenario of an outcome there. The other big question that they are looking at, obviously, is there's basic damages, which there's a big question. It's in order to sue for damages, there has to be damage done to the plaintiff, i.e. they have to have suffered some form of harm. It's going to be hard for the plaintiffs, I think, to argue that they did suffer harm in this case, and it's something that is touched on in the article here. The season pass, initially at $30 and then later at $50, includes $60 worth of content. So you are getting more for your money than you're paying. So you're getting good value there. That's even without the Creation Club in it. If you were to add the Creation Club in it, obviously the value of it would then skyrocket, but given that you're already getting a collection of products for less than their individual prices, it's hard to say that you are then deprived of something because something came along afterwards that also has value and may or may not be related to it. So I think there's a big stretch there that they're going to have a hard time arguing in a court that there were actually significant damages sustained. Whether or not this has been settled or not, I don't think it has. The article seems to imply it hasn't, but it also says they're on to discovery phase. So I don't know if that would have to be dealt with before or afterwards. Could be either. Could be that they're trying to discover whether or not it is relevant and whether or not they have a case for damages, which would actually make sense. So somewhat up in the air there as to whether or not they do actually have a case for damages at all. The other side is, if they do, there's the possibility of punitive damages, which they are pushing for, basically trying to add additional potential multi-billion-dollar fines, for want of a better word. It's not a fine, it's damages, but it works much the same way on top of the initial damages that would go to plaintiffs, basically to punish Bethesda for their actions, which I think is very, very unlikely. There's a consulting lawyer who the journalists have asked his opinion on it, mentioned in this. He says he doesn't reckon it's going to happen, and on my own take, I don't think it would happen either. Massive multi-billion-dollar punitive damages for something that is the first time it's come up seems unlikely, and the amount of harm that has been done by this, if any, is quite small, really. So multiple billions of dollars in punitive damages for the sake of a few quid per person seems pretty unlikely and unreasonable to me. If it was something that had happened repeatedly, and this was, the third, fourth, fifth time that Bethesda had been sued over something like this, that might be a different matter, but it isn't. So I can't see that being a thing. It's theoretically possible, but it seems unlikely. For gamers, what kind of impact it'll have, I don't imagine a great deal. The acquisition by Microsoft might get delayed by this. If something like that were to happen, it would significantly increase the likelihood of a settlement occurring, an out-of-court settlement, which would likely mean a big expenditure on Bethesda's part, but it's not going to hit development of games. It's not going to impact anything that players would experience. It might potentially change how they market things in the future, but in a serious way, I don't think there's going to be a massive impact on gamers. So, That's basically my take. Not necessarily the strongest case on either side. Bethesda have definitely dropped the ball in a few areas, and also the plaintiffs have some uphill battles with their arguments, both for whether or not there are any damages sustained at all, and whether or not the Creation Club is DLC. The definition of DLC basically not being in any way formalised at the moment makes that very difficult. So definitely issues on both sides there, and whatever outcome there is, chances are serious outcomes are unlikely. A settlement is a possibility, it's a reasonable possibility, which would mean significant expenditure and a bad year for Bethesda, but certainly wouldn't be the end of the game for them, particularly not in light of the acquisition by Microsoft. The acquisition by Microsoft might get delayed, which, for those who have concerns about whether or not things are going to go Xbox exclusive, they're not. Then that might be even further off into the future, but in short, I don't think it's going to make a great deal of difference to gamers. It's an interesting thing to talk about, an interesting thing to look into, and I find it all very, very fascinating, and way too into this sort of stuff, especially given that I have no direct involvement. I think this was quite interesting. I hope you guys found it interesting and informative too. Obviously, as I said at the start, some strong opinions of mine in there. I don't think this is going to amount to a great deal at all, and I don't think it is particularly genuinely brought either, this case. I think it is... I'm not going to say it's frivolous, because that's an overly legal term, and it's not necessarily the same thing as what I mean. But I don't think it's a particularly honest-hearted case, shall we say. I think there is an argument to be made that Bethesda did not behave in a particularly fantastic manner, but it's also the timing of it following Fallout 76. It just looks like somebody said, well, Bethesda are on the back foot, they look bad already. That gives us even more of an in for a legal case to get some money out of them. My opinion, I could be wildly wrong on that, might be completely unfair. Probably isn't, in my opinion, but, you know, there we go. That's kind of what my opinion is. So, thank you very much for watching. High five to all of you who made it to this stage in the video. I realise it's been quite the wordy, in-depth thing, so kudos for sticking with it. I greatly admire your perseverance, and I greatly appreciate it as well. If you're interested in such things, likes, subs are always very, very welcome, as are follows over on social media. You can find all the links down below. If you're interested in such things as well, we have a merch store down there while you're having a look at social media. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, all manner of good things on there, mouse mats, so do check it out. There's some cool stuff. I've got some of it down here right now. And very much appreciate your support in that way, as I do with the channel memberships as well via that blue join button if you're interested in that sort of thing. There's some cool little add-ons and bits and pieces that you can benefit from if you're interested in that. So, massive, massive thanks to all of you for your continued support and your patience in my long, rambly video. So, I'm going to sign off now. So, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to speaking to you all very, very soon.